Hey everybody, what's up? It's Matthew here. Thanks for checking into the YouTube channel. Today we're going to talk about preaching a little bit. Now, a long time ago and far, far away, I started a little series called Preaching Lab on this YouTube channel, and I think I have a playlist where they're all kind of collected. Hopefully I do, because I just said it. But I want to return to that series right now, in particular with some emphasis on the idea of application in the sermon. Now, I realize that not everybody who listens to this channel is a preacher or a teacher or anything like that, but everybody should be a sermon listener, whether they ever deliver a sermon or not. And I think most people will find that the sermons that really hit the hardest in the heart, which is exactly where we're aiming our preaching arrows, right, to the heart of the person, is in the application of the text to the life. I don't think anybody would advise preaching a sermon in which there's no application whatsoever, but sometimes young preachers especially don't apply the text very well when they preach. They're not exactly sure how to apply the text. Especially young pastors, I think, and maybe I'm thinking especially of the Reformed tradition of which I am a part. They tend to do very well on doctrine. They tend to be a little bit doctrinal heavy. Again, I'm talking about Reformed people here. But the real difficulty is to apply the text to the life. And when I look back at the preaching of the Puritans, Jonathan Edwards and others, one of the things that we realize is that preaching application was the main stress of all biblical preaching in their day. And here's what I mean by that. A typical sermon in the 1700s and the 1600s had three parts to it. The first part, the shortest part, was called the text. And in the text, the preacher was basically to give the literary genre connections, the context of that particular passage. For instance, he would name the fact that it's a parable or where it comes in the gospel or what part of the epistle of Paul he's looking at or how this section fits into the rest of the Pentateuch or whatever. The text section was rather short, surprisingly, and that's because most hearers of sermons in those days had a very comprehensive grasp of the scriptures, and so you didn't really need to say much about where it was found. Modern people and modern preachers, I think, do well to do a little bit more of explication of where the text is found in the context of the whole of the Bible and in redemption history, but the Puritans really didn't do a lot, and again, they were just assuming a lot of knowledge on the part of their hearers. The second part of the sermon was a larger part, though not the largest of all, and that was the doctrinal section. Every sermon had some kind of a main doctrinal statement. If you read, for instance, the sermons of Jonathan Edwards, which I have right here, almost every single sermon, in fact, I can't think of any that he would preach that didn't have a major doctrinal assertion, some kind of a thesis statement, a doctrine on which the rest of the sermon would be built, sometimes multiple doctrinal statements. But the real emphasis in Puritan-style preaching was in the application. And again, the application was the largest part of the 3/3 of the Puritan-style sermon. At least half of the entire sermon was taken up in the application. Now, there are several sermons in which the preacher, and again, I'm thinking of Jonathan Edwards here in particular, would have a sermon that's built over multiple preaching occasions. So for instance, on the Lord's Day, they may meet in the morning and then again in the afternoon or the evening. And so one full sermon might actually stretch out over multiple sermon preaching units. And sometimes there are sermons that are just all application of what has come prior in the doctrine and in the text. But let's go to what I think might be helpful to modern day preachers right now, and that is multiple ways that we can apply the text as we're preaching to the hearts of the people. And again, if you're not a preacher, think of how you listen to the particular sermon, okay? So young pastors, I think very often, they think of application, they think of, okay, well, what should I tell the person to do after hearing the sermon? I guess I should tell them to read the Bible more. I guess I should tell them to pray harder. And I guess I should tell them to invite somebody to church next week. I have no problem with any of those three applications. They are good applications as far as that goes. However, just do more, try harder type applications do tend to fall flat in that they don't really fill out the whole picture of what expository application really looks like in the heart. So what I've been doing lately is I've been examining the sermons of Jonathan Edwards and Thomas Watson and others, and I've been looking for the kinds of sermon applications that they commonly give. And surprisingly, here's what I found. Check this out. All right, so I've got this book right here, A Puritan Theology, Doctrine for Life by Beakey and Jones, a book that I've talked about on this channel before. And I realized that in their section on Puritan preaching, they'd already done part of the homework for me. They'd already come up with 6 types of application that sermon preachers should be thinking about. In fact, they cited a document here that I'm about to put up on the screen right now. What you are looking at with me is one of the more neglected aspects of the product of the Westminster Assembly. Now, you're fairly familiar, I hope, with the fact that the Westminster Divines put together a confession of faith, 33 chapters of Reformed doctrine. They also gave us 2 catechetical devices. We have the larger catechism and the shorter catechism. You are already familiar with that. Did you know, though, that they also gave us another document, it's much lesser known, called the Directory for Public Worship? And herein they tell us what worship services should look like in general and what preaching should look like in particular. So here's where it gets very interesting, is that the Westminster Divines actually give multiple ways, I think it's 6 or 7 ways, that sermons should be applied to the heart of the hearer. So let's look at them right now on the screen. In the use of instruction or information in the knowledge of truth. Okay, so the first way that Puritans would apply the teaching that they're giving in that preaching unit is the use or the improvement, or sometimes it's called the application of instruction. That is, what do you need to come away knowing after hearing the sermon? Obviously, one of the main faculties of the human life is the life of the mind. And so sermons are, of course, designed to inform. Hopefully, there aren't too many sermons out there being preached that aren't informative in at least some way. But in the first application, and again, they don't all have all 6 or 7 of these. Some of them focus on 1 or 2 or 3 of the others to exclusion of the rest. But very often you'll see an application of instruction. That is, what do you need to know in the mind after you walk away from the sermon? Do you need to have this content memorized? Do you need to have a better intellectual grasp of this concept or idea? And so the first application would be one of information, instruction, or idea. The second one would be the confutation of false doctrines. Now that you know this, how does this disabuse us of the false teaching of the unbelieving world or of the cults or of the Roman Catholic Church or something like that? They would often take that teaching and say, if this is true, then therefore, by definition, this is not true. And so the second type of application would be confutation. Hopefully, pastors are still doing that. They're still showing how the Bible refutes the doctrine of the cults or the world or some other group that may be teaching. Next, here's the one we're probably most familiar with, what is called here in the Directory for Public Worship, exhortation to duty. Go out now and do this. Once you hear a sermon, there should be some aspect of go and do. Now, here we have to be very careful because we don't want to be moralists. We don't want to be rigorists. We don't want to be telling people that their spiritual life somehow depends on their performance of duties or works. But nevertheless, and we have to be real with this, the Bible does command us to do things. So here is your application to pray, to read the Bible, to serve the poor, to love the sick, to forgive your enemies, to pray for those who persecute you, etc. And so this is probably what most younger pastors would think of as a good application to the sermon. Indeed, it is. Next, there would be the application of dehortation or public admonition. Now, the Puritans really majored on this, and I think a lot of contemporary preachers get a little bit squeamish when it comes to this. In fact, what does the word dehortation mean? Well, let's define it. It's a rebuke. It's a warning. It's the opposite of exhortation. If exhortation is go and do this, dehortation is stop, desist, cease from doing that. And a preacher needs to have the gumption, old-fashioned word there, to stand in the pulpit and say, y'all are acting the fool and you need to quit doing the following things. And so a good preacher will dehort his people from taking certain activities or thoughts or characteristics into their life or into their heart. Now, here is one of the most beautiful ones, I think, of all. Most Puritan sermons have some kind of improvement or application or use, they would call it, of comfort or consolation to the soul. Having heard this, here is how you more deeply trust and confide in the goodness of the Lord. Very often, this would be part of the sermon that really, really comforts the heart. It warms the soul as he or she, the hearer, is reminded that God's promises are true, his character is reliable, his covenants are secure, his Son, the Christ, his death is infallible in the efficacy of its blood for his people. Here is where we tell the people to trust and rely in the safety and assurance that we have in the gospel. So there's definitely that, and good preachers will always do that. And then here, this one's kind of buried in the paragraph, to examine themselves, and this would be the use of examination or trial, wherein the preacher would tell his people, you really need to look deep into your own heart. And here's where the preacher says, I can only take you so far. You need to do the rest of the application here. I'm going to tell you what you should be thinking about in your heart, but only you can do that soul-searching work to find out whether what I'm saying is true of you. So for instance, let's say, just picking an example here, he's preaching on the Lord's Supper, and there's Judas ready to betray the Christ. You have to say, people, ask yourself, who are you in this moment? Are you Judas, who's about ready to depart the door and betray the Lord Christ? Or are you John, who's laying trustingly, confiding on the breast of the Lord Jesus Christ? Here's where you tell the people, look in your own heart, do the work of application for yourself, and you face off with what you see when you do, in fact, look into your heart. Okay, so there's 6 or 7 ways that the Puritans used to apply the scriptures and the sermons, and I would say, young preachers out there, read more Puritan sermons, look at the way they use application or improvement of the text, and go therefore and do likewise. That's all I have to say for you today. I will put links to the books I mentioned in the description of this video. I do love you lots, and we will talk to you later.